policymaking. This is really the theme that we will explore in today's workshop, and we're very grateful also to you, Agata, particularly for traveling to Geneva and share our experiences, your experiences with us, and also comment on what is going on in the global, national spheres in terms of activism, in terms of policymaking. And so this will be the focus of today, and Maria and the colleagues will further present it in the course of the day. A warm welcome to the participants, as I said, who are coming from different countries, from Europe, and we will have specific introductions in the coming session. So the Albert Hirschman Centre on Democracy is one of the 9 interdisciplinary research centers at the Geneva Graduate Institute. We are a team of about 40 researchers and affiliated faculty, and we are exploring democratic practices from an interdisciplinary perspective. So we have a number of ongoing research projects. We also are partnering with a number of academic and non-academic institutions for those projects, also for public events. And I think today is really a very important also day for us in order to discuss with our colleagues from UNRISD, ILO, AHCD, and other organizations about precisely the topic of just transition. So very warm welcome again. Thank you for joining. And I would like to give the word to Katja on behalf of our partner and organizer for this workshop. Thank you and welcome.
Yeah, good morning to everybody here in the room and also to the online participants. My name is Katja Huyo. I'm Senior Research Coordinator at UNRISD. UNRISD is the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development. We have our 60th anniversary this year, and our mandate is to conduct research that helps to improve policy and practice, both in the United Nations, but especially also in the member states. We are collaborating with academics. We are very grateful for the opportunity to co-host this event with the Albert Hirschman Centre. So thanks again to Maria Maxi and Christine Ludwinger. We very much appreciate the collaborations with academic centers, with civil society, and with policymakers and practitioners. And our key research area is, as the name says, social development. But we are increasingly concerned also with any type of current development challenge and the sustainability transition, and making that transition a just one, a fair one, is very much at the heart of the work of the Institute. So we are very happy to be here today. A colleague of ours will join in the first session online, and my colleague Maggie Carter and I will talk a little bit about a flagship report that we published last year. And very much looking forward to the discussions today, and also to think about future collaborations on this very important topic of just transitions and the role of youth. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It's my great pleasure to be moderating this public event today, because it builds on a strong collaboration with the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development. And we are very pleased and delighted to be joined by distinguished keynote speakers who will be addressing the challenges and opportunities pertaining to the digital transition, the environmental transition, the energy transition. We have with us in person Agata, welcome Agata, but also joining online from Brussels, Mr. Frank Siebern-Thomas, who is actually heading the Fair and Green and Digital Transitions at the Research Unit at the DG Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion, European Commission. Frank, you are with us, right?
Yes, I can hear you. Good morning to Geneva.
Excellent. So let's start with you, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation to speak at our event today and for joining us online. Thank you. Let's start with you.
Sorry, we can't hear you. I can see you speaking, but I think you're muted.
I guess now you can hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, apologies. I share again the screen. There, it doesn't mute again. Okay, can you still hear me? Yes?
Yeah.
Hello. Okay. Bonjour, good morning again from Brussels. Thank you so much for your invitation to speak at this workshop. It's a great pleasure. And I regret that I couldn't come in person to Geneva, which would have an even bigger pleasure to present. As was said, I'm working in a unit called Fair, Green and Digital Transitions Research in DG Employment, the unit which was set up some 1.5 years ago, and we've had as its main mission, I guess, areas you all mentioned in your introductions, namely to conduct policy analysis for supporting fair transitions, fair, green and digital transitions, to contribute to policy development in this field, including by involving youth organizations, social partners, and others. I'll say a word about this. And also by programming research in the context of Horizon Europe, where DG Employment is co-chair of one of the research clusters, so-called Cluster 2 on culture, creativity, and inclusive societies, where issues you will be discussing like in social transformations, but also fair transitions and democratic participation are researched. In my presentation, I will try to give you a snapshot of these three areas and our activities in those fields. The main message probably is one that we believe in order to reach our ambitious climate targets and in order to achieve an acceleration of the green transition, which we have to, which we all agree is necessary in view also of the perma-crisis through which we are living, a pandemic, a war, an energy and inflation crisis. We need to put in place, ensure that those transitions are just and that they are implemented and happening in a fair, inclusive and democratic manner. And this is what I will try to present. Let me move to the next slides. If I manage, I will start with a context, speak about perceptions of Europeans on the green transition, show you some main evidence we have on challenges and opportunities, and if time permits, also go a bit into policy measures at European level and activities to mainstream. I will add, as the previous mentioned, that the purpose of your workshop is also to look out for collaboration, future collaboration topics. I will mention also a couple of research topics and upcoming calls in this area. Let me start with the context, which was well known to most of you. The context is one where in the long term, we have set ambitious transition targets, climate and energy targets towards 2030 and 2050. Europe wants to become the first climate neutral continent by 2050 and has set itself an ambitious climate emission reduction target of at least 55% greenhouse gas emission reductions by 2030. Those targets are enshrined, legally binding in the first EU climate law. And over the last 2 years, the Commission has put in place very important legislative packages, so-called Fit for 55 package, and others to adjust European legislation, targets, price incentives, but also rules to enable Europe to achieve those targets. And we believe we are on track to meeting those targets. At the same time, there are short-term policy developments since mid-21 with rising energy prices and inflation, which were exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. The EU has reacted to those by setting up in early 22 a so-called Repower EU plan to ensure energy supply and independence and to accelerate the green transition. So in response to both crises, the pandemic and the geopolitical crisis and energy and inflation developments, the EU has always reacted by maintaining the cap and by, if anything, increasing the ambition and stating that we need to accelerate the green transition. This is largely supported by a large majority of Europeans, but at the same time, obviously also a majority of Europeans is concerned about energy prices and inflation and the challenges and unequal impact this may bring. And to underline the urgency even further, as certainly further speakers in this session will highlight, the IPCC report of 22 has highlighted this very clearly to say that we are not on track globally to reach the 1.5 degree target of the Paris Agreement. And if we do not increase our ambitions to reach that target and to accelerate our transition, the only way out would be massive social and societal transformations, which obviously shows the risks here. Executive Vice President Timmermans, when he presented the European climate law in the European Parliament, has been very clear about this. Yes, there will just be no transition, and we believe this holds even more now in the new and changed context. This is also supported by a recent Eurobarometer published a few weeks ago on focusing on the support to Ukraine. But again, a large majority of Europeans supports the acceleration of the energy transition, also to gain independence and ensure energy supply in this context. The political background, a snapshot, I guess many of you are working on this on the European level. What are the main tools which help us, which allow us, we believe, to put in place and to ensure just transitions? The main one on the employment and social policy side is the so-called European Pillar of Social Rights, which is a list of 20 principles of for employment and social policy in Europe to ensure a strong social Europe. It's also both to support the recovery from COVID, but to support just transitions. And it goes from access to education, training, gender equality, equal opportunities, adequate incomes and wages, to access to essential services, including energy and transport. In this context, there have also been targets have been set for 2030 on the social and employment side, namely to reach an employment rate of 78% by 2030, to ensure that at least 60% of all adults participate in training every year by 2030, from today less than 40%, and that at least 15 million people are lifted out of poverty or social exclusion, among them at least 5 million children. You have a similar digital side. I understand you are interested in both areas. So here the Commission has proposed a declaration of digital rights and principles as a way to make sure that the European way for the digital transition is one which puts people at the center. Also in this context, the targets have been set for 2030. Some are listed here on the slide, namely to form at least 20 million ICT specialists by 2030 to make sure that 80% of the population have basic digital skills, or again that public services, medical records, digital IT, etc., are accessible online for people. The main purpose of this declaration, as I said, is to put people and their rights at the center of the digital transformation in Europe. This includes, among others, among the 6 main objectives, to foster participation in the digital public space of all. The Commission also has action frameworks. I would like to highlight, given the topic of your session, the European Year of Youth in 22. Every year, the European Commission dedicates the year to a specific topic and promotes actions in this area. So there were thousands of activities held in 72 countries around the globe, ensuring policy dialogues of young people with each member of the college, and 22 youth conferences were held, including a dedicated European youth event as part of the conference on the future of Europe. And those conclusions have been fed into policy making, and participants and policymakers have said that's important now to ensure transparent follow-up from all three institutions in the European Union, to make sure that the opinions, dreams, and ideas of European citizens are reflected fairly in policy making. And last but not least, I would like to highlight a couple of action frameworks where young people are involved, notably the European Climate Pact, which invites people, communities, and organizations, again at global level, to connect and share knowledge, but also to take commitments and pledges and follow up on those together. And in particular, a number of Climate Pact ambassadors have been nominated, including young people. And in all our policy making, obviously, we hold regular consultations, including with youth associations and notably the European Youth Forum, which is the umbrella organization of hundreds of youth organizations at European level, is regularly invited to participate in policy making. Coming briefly to the perceptions on the fairness of the green transition, we have conducted last year a Eurobarometer, which is a representative survey across the member states in the European Union. We have asked people about their perceptions of the green transition. In a nutshell, everyone agrees basically that there is a need for a just transition. But when asked if people are confident that we can reach by 2050 our ambitious targets to provide sustainable energy products and services that are affordable for all, we see that the public is split, and that even a slight majority is not confident that this is going to happen. We believe this is the central issue for just transition, to make sure that we provide the certain framework of certainty, planning certainty, but also showcase that this transition can happen and will happen, and allow everyone to engage. This is even more important as a majority of Europeans agrees that this transition is important. 70% at least of Europeans are frightened by climate change. 77% see a personal responsibility to act to fight climate change, and more than 70% also say that they could do more than they are doing actually to fight climate change. When asked about what are the employment aspects, also here Europeans tend to be rather optimistic. Around 60% believe that the climate transition can overall create good quality jobs and can create more jobs than it may destroy. But people are less certain that they have the skills that allow them to contribute to this transition. And although a majority wishes to be in jobs that contribute to advancing the green transition, only a third thinks that they currently are in such a job. So there's also potential to reviewing probably jobs and creating new jobs, obviously in the circular economy and new parts of the green economy. And we have asked the Europeans if they support certain policy actions. And you see on this slide that in general, there's large support for all kinds of policy support to promote the green transition, notably increasing investments in public infrastructure, subsidizing vulnerable people to help them face increasing energy costs or behavioral changes, encourage private companies through rules and incentives to speed up the transition, including by reskilling and upskilling their workforce, but also by adapting to more circular and sustainable processes. There's also a majority for taxing products and services and redistributing revenues, and even a slight majority for allocating a quota of energy to each citizen as part of the discussion. Those data are available. They are also available for research, including the microdata that's of interest. The results are published, and you can look in particular of interest probably for discussions today, the specific voice of youth, because young people tend to be even more pronounced in their views, obviously. So they are more confident that we can reach our targets. They are more positive towards EU action overall. They are more willing to contribute, to be in jobs, to contribute to fighting climate change. 80% see a personal responsibility much higher. They use more often public transport. They are more willing to reduce energy consumption due to environmental reasons. And they are also agree more strongly that the richest 20% in their country should make efforts to reduce their energy consumption. With this, a word on the evidence, the main evidence we have on what we consider as main opportunities and challenges for the green transition. In a summary, we believe that the green transition holds the potential for a triple dividend if the right accompanying policies are in place. And this triple dividend is reducing emissions, creating quality jobs, and increasing the well-being of everyone. There's significant job opportunities in the green economy, not in renewable energy production, in construction, in the circular economy, and in many other fields. Yet we find ourselves also in a situation of increasing labor and skill shortages, which could become an obstacle to the green transition, notably to a fast green transition, if not addressed. At the same time, we find ourselves in a situation where European labor markets have shown great resilience coming out of the pandemic, but the risks and uncertainties are equally high. And last but not least, a challenge remains to include all those underrepresented or currently excluded or on the margins of the labor market. This includes not only people affected by the transition and potential job losses stemming from the transition, but people more generally in vulnerable situations and also underrepresented groups in renewable energy production, for example, in other parts. I just show one slide to highlight the situation of the labor market. This is the chart showing the evolution of youth unemployment in the European Union since 2008. And you see that youth unemployment levels, while still above 10%, have come down significantly over the last time, indicating, as I said, both the resilience of labor markets and the increasing signs of labor and skill shortages. As regards the main impacts and fairness challenges, I would highlight four. First, and the main issue here is that while I said there's a lot of potential, the issue to be addressed obviously is that the expected impacts are unequal. They're unequal across groups, across regions, across sectors. So these maps show you on the left, the darker blue ones, the regions in the European Union with a high employment shares in energy-intensive industries. These are those which have the highest, obviously, challenges to restructure sectors, employment within sectors or within value chains, particularly automotive value chains, but also other energy-intensive industries. On the right side, you have maps produced by our colleagues at the Joint Research Centre in Sevilla, the Commission's in-house research service, and they show you the darker shaded regions, the potential to create jobs in renewables, wind and solar energy. And one challenge obviously will be to match these ambitions and to come up with the strategies for regions, taking into account the respective challenges. The second challenge is the one on diversity in the sector. As I said, a lot of jobs created in the green economy that are needed to support the transition will be jobs of manual workers, technicians, people with vocational education and training, and those are, let's say, currently not always easy to find. And on the right side, we also know that women in particular are underrepresented in the workforce in the energy sector, including in renewable energy, and even more so in STEM jobs, scientific jobs or technical jobs. So here certainly is a great potential to also increase the integration of women in renewable energy jobs, where there may be lack of training or skills, but there will also maybe cultural barriers to join those sectors. A third challenge is energy poverty. More than 35 million Europeans, according to surveys, are unable, and these are figures from before the energy crisis, to heat or cool their homes properly. And this hits in particular, but not only, the lowest income groups, but also lower middle income groups. Current developments risk increasing that number, and obviously policy has to take into account that as part of the transition, energy poverty must not increase, and the burden must not be put unduly on lowest income groups. In relation here, you have interesting findings from the World Inequality Lab in Paris with their World Inequality Report and Climate Inequality Report, where they look at emissions by income groups, showing that in particular the highest income groups contribute mostly to emissions and have maybe contributed less to emission reductions in the past. And an interesting finding is, the two interesting findings highlighted here is that the bottom 50% of the world population contribute to 12% of global emissions compared to 75 and bearing 75% of relative income losses. And in the report this year, the World Inequality Lab highlights that for the first time in history, according to their analysis, carbon inequalities are larger within countries than between countries, which is a pointer to necessary policy action. And the last slide I would like to find here, sorry for another analytical slide. This is work we are doing with the Joint Research Centre to assess the expected distributional impacts of energy and climate policies. The black line here is the most important one, which is negative across all income deciles from the first to the 10th income decile, and they show the impacts on well-being or purchasing power of certain energy measures such as environmental or energy taxes or carbon prices. And obviously those effects are regressive if unaddressed. And the colored lines show you different scenarios of redistributing a part or the entirety of revenues from such taxation or carbon pricing to lower income households, which shows you that with revenue recycling policies in place, at least certain income groups can be put off better than before. This leads me to the policy section, and here I would like to recall that the European Green Deal, this is a slide showing the European Green Deal is a massive action plan, the massive transformation agenda, which goes beyond climate policy. So it covers all areas of economy and society. It includes reforms in the area of environmental policy, food systems, repair and recycling, circular economy, and many others. And it has as its two main horizontal instruments or features, on the one side, the just transition, and on the other side, sustainable financing to also make sure that investments are available to support the just transition. Main policy areas, policy measures we put in place to ensure just transitions, in addition to those I mentioned already before, are financial support. So a number of financial support programs in the European Union. It includes the cohesion policy funds, like the European Social Fund Plus in particular, which supports people, the reskilling and upskilling and social inclusion, but also the Just Transition Fund, which supports coal regions who have to phase out coal and fossil fuel industries, and more recently, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, a 750 billion euros program, which was set up to support the transition out of COVID and the recovery from COVID. And this one, as I will show in a second, has a focus on climate and on the green and digital transition, but also on future generations and intergenerational fairness. And the second element I would like to highlight, that's the last bullet on this slide, is a council recommendation on ensuring a fair transition. This is a legislative piece we have prepared to provide policy guidance to member states on how to ensure just transition at the national level. And here, in view of the discussions today, I would like to highlight why this policy recommendation, on which there's a slide in the next slide, which shows you the overall structure. We can go into this in the discussion if you want. But the main focus of this recommendation is to ask member states to assess the main challenges and make sure that their employment and skills policies, but also their social protection policies and policies giving access to social essential services are geared to the challenges. And what I would like to stress in this context is that we make sure and call upon member states in this recommendation that they put in place a whole of society approach, involve social partners, civil society organizations, all stakeholders as part of this transition, as part of designing, implementing, and monitoring just transition policies, as otherwise this transition cannot be achieved.
Frank, sorry,
yes.
I have to interrupt. I need to apologize, but because time is running out, could you please wrap up?
Yes.
Because we need to leave the room at 10 o'clock just so.
Okay, I will wrap up. There are you find two slides with two important financial programs,
Fantastic.
the Social Climate Fund, I can say about this, but also the RIF, where I will jump over this, where I will we just wanted to say that the money which member states can use to support the recovery from the pandemic has to go to support climate and digital transitions, but also there's one focus on intergenerational fairness, youth, education, and skills. A lot of focus these years is on competitiveness and skills to increase the capacity of European manufacturing to produce the goods needed and services for the green transition. And this year is the European Year of Skills. I would like to highlight this following the European Year of Youth. So with a lot of actions to ensure that reskilling, upskilling is in place. And let me, with the last focus on the last slide, make the link with the research part, just to say that we try to mainstream just transition in many areas, including our research policy, and in our international relations. With the International Labour Organization in Geneva, we have set up a Just Transition Pavilion at COP last year, which we continue to do, and where we also invite researchers, organizations, and others to present us good practice examples they want to showcase or results. We want to have this as a space to match people working on Just Transition. And in our Horizon Europe program, and I will finish with this, we do propose calls for research, future research on Just Transition, well-being, and also on democracy. And with the last two slides, I will just show you examples of topics we have in these programs. For example, related to fair transition and well-being, designing strategies towards sustainable economic policy paradigms, tackling inequalities in the green and digital transition, or looking at the employment and social impacts of changing supply chains. And regarding democracy, my last slide, you have topics such as those shown here on the slide: democratic governance for times of disruptive change, multi-level governance, digital democracy, and also future scenarios and young visions for European democracy. And with this, I would like to invite you to contribute to those and look forward to question and discussion.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We will certainly exploit those research opportunities. And thank you so much for providing us with all this data and information and highlighting the challenges and opportunities pertaining to how we can deliver fairness to policy action. And now we move on to Agata, who is going to talk about the challenges and opportunities in relation to activism. And Agata Meysner is a member of the Youth Advisory Board at the AHCD and president of Generation Climate Europe, which is actually the largest coalition of youth-led networks on climate and environmental issues at the European level. Agata, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm Agata Meysner. I'm the president of Generation Climate Europe. And for those of you who haven't heard of us, we're the largest youth climate coalition. As was mentioned, we gather youth-led networks and we focus on various climate and environmental issues. And just transition has been one of our key priorities for the past few years. So I'm very happy to talk to you a little bit more about the work that we do and why this is important in the context of youth engagement. So when we look at discussions around just transition in the context of international organizations such as the European Union, we often see that the focus is on workers in high polluting sectors in specific regions. But this is not a complete picture. There are a couple of elements missing there. This doesn't include the focus on gender and social justice, the fact that women, particularly women from marginalized communities, are disproportionately affected. It doesn't concern the bigger discussion around our economic system, recognizing that one of the core causes of the climate crisis is our overconsumption of natural resources, and that is not being addressed. It also puts forward quite a limited notion of green jobs. It doesn't consider education and care, for example, which are also sectors that are predominantly dominated by women, and also women, again, from underrepresented communities. And finally, this consideration around intergenerational justice is something that is very much limited and doesn't put a full picture on the impact on young people and future generations. The European Commission has highlighted the importance of including young people. We have two key instruments that have been used. The toolkit, Youth for a Just Transition, that was published in 2021, and the call for a project called the EU Teens for Green. Now, the toolkit is a toolkit for policymakers. It puts forward ideas and recommendations on how to engage youth in decisions in the just transition, and it puts forward certain examples of how to organize it, certain principles that are supposed to guide the member states in the implementation of the just transition mechanism. The second instrument that you see is EU Teens for Green, which was launched in 2022, last year, and it's an experimental call for projects that support youth-led initiatives in the transition regions, and this is also where GC is involved. Now, on one hand, we saw the steps that the European Commission took to respond to that need to include young people in the just transition. But on the other hand, there was and there is no official assessment on how youth was actually involved in the just transition mechanism and its implementation. So that's where we came in. We said, well, this is missing. Let's take the initiative. Let's use our work, our connections, and our expertise to provide that. And we partner up in late 2021 with another organization called Bankwatch, which is a monitoring NGO active predominantly in Central and Eastern Europe. And we produced a series of reports. The first edition came out in May last year, where we covered 12 member states. The second edition in October last year, which covered 15 countries. And the third edition that's coming out soon, which will again increase the number of countries that are being targeted. And here we went to the ground, we interviewed a number of youth organizations, youth associations, activists, students who were or were not involved in the just transition processes. Now, what are the key findings? There was some form of varying quality of youth engagement in 11 out of 15 countries analyzed so far. When present, the typical formats that were used were calls and dialogues with different politicians, predominantly local, regional politicians, because that's what the just transition mechanism is focused on. They were also sometimes virtual workshops. However, they were predominantly focused on consolidated drafts. So these were final versions. These were versions that, in fact, couldn't be changed anymore. It was more so about getting comments and thoughts of young people on the final version, but not so much actually co-creating the processes together. And then we also saw some youth representatives who were invited to civil society working groups who could participate in the discussions and who could contribute with their ideas. Overall quality of that engagement was mixed. There was no harmonized way of engagement. It differed across countries, it differed across regions within the same countries. And at the same time, we do see some good news. We have some countries that have already confirmed that they will continue with some form of youth engagement in the monitoring phase, which is the next phase in the context of the Just Transition mechanism. So as you can see, the confirmed one are Czechia, Estonia, Greece, and Poland. In 3 of those countries, in fact, we saw very good engagement that I will tell you a little bit more about in a moment. And then there are 2 that are announced but not yet confirmed. There were certain political commitments being made in Romania and in Slovakia. Now, you can see a summary map. So the green ones are countries where we did report youth engagement, again of varying quality, but it was present. In countries that are marked as red, we couldn't find any sort of examples of youth engagement. Now, this does not mean that we can say with absolute certainty that it did not happen, but there was no evidence or youth stakeholders, activists, organizations that were in any way or form that we could find that were involved in the process. And we have reached out through various connections and networks that we have to try to find them. And then, as you can see, there are a couple countries that are still to be covered that we're working on at the moment and will also be covered in the upcoming edition, again in the context of that upcoming monitoring phase. I wanted to tell you a little bit more about these 3 best practices that we found. This is based on our analysis. There are 3 examples in Poland, in Estonia, and in Greece. And in Konin, in Poland, at first, authorities were not particularly interested in engaging in people, but as a result of self-mobilization from the side of youth, they managed to get the attention of decision makers, and there was a working group for young people specifically to focus on youth-related issues, and young representatives were also invited to participate in the working group meetings that were focused on the territorial just transition plans. Some of their inputs were included in the final versions of the territorial just transition plans, as we've heard from the people involved. Now in Florida, in Greece, similarly as in Poland again, initially decision makers were not interested in engaging in people, but they did manage to get the attention of the government representatives after numerous actions, advocacy initiatives, reaching out to the network and calling out for the importance of youth in the just transition. And we saw that the National Ministry organized a call to hear young people's perspectives, and they also brought together youth representatives in an event with Commissioner Ferreira, who's the Commissioner for Cohesion and Reforms. Now, finally, in Estonia, the national government and the local NGO created together a citizen assembly. This is something that the local NGO was specialized in, working on a number of different topics, this time focusing on young people and just transition. And this is where they could brainstorm together and give their inputs to the just transition plan. And in fact, afterwards, authorities reported on which parts of the inputs they adopted and which parts they did not and why. So this was a very good example of a follow-up mechanism, making sure also that youth representatives know to what extent and how their inputs are being used in this process. Now, after analyzing the state of youth engagement and the just transition processes on the ground, we wanted to ensure that these voices of local youth and the findings of our report are widely heard at the EU level. And this is really what we do at Generation Climate Europe. We ensure that the priorities of young people are represented in key climate and environmental decision-making processes in the EU. And we basically translate their needs and interests into specific policies, linking them to a specific file that's going on, a vote, a legislation, directive, regulation, or whatever else is happening that's of relevance at the EU level. Now, as you can see in a couple of photos I managed to gather, our team spoke at various conferences, events, workshops, and we also managed to bring together the local activists that were interviewed for the report and were part of the study. For example, from Greece and Estonia, the great cases that we had, to share their experience and to really talk a little bit more about how it was to get involved, what it meant for them, and what was the process behind the scenes as well. So this was a couple of events that were mentioned. I mean, the Just Transition Mechanism platform, our representative talked with two commissioners. You can see the photo on the left. This was May last year, I believe, and a couple of other events like the European Week of Regions and Cities, the Territorial Just Transition Plans stakeholder meeting, and a couple others. Now, this brings me to the 3 recommendations from our study specifically on the Just Transition Mechanism. Number 1 is for EU member states to include youth representatives in the monitoring committees. This is the next stage that we're seeing at the moment. And this is extremely important because inclusion of young people is not just about initial ideas, it's also seeing how we can implement the ideas, monitoring the progress, understanding how the ideas and the processes are developing. Now, for the European Commission to keep encouraging member states to include youth in the Just Transition, for example, through the membership in those monitoring committees, but also projects dedicated to Just Transition that are financed from the EU level. And finally, for the European Parliament to use all its monitoring powers to ensure that local communities are properly engaged. This is really important to connect with the local communities that are the ones who are experiencing the biggest consequences of the climate crisis and are, in fact, one of the most important stakeholders in the Just Transition. Now, this brings me to meaningful youth engagement. Although in the past years, the role of young people has been receiving increasing political attention with initiatives that were also mentioned, like the European Year of Youth, who are facilitating this process. We also see, unfortunately, growing examples of youth washing, whereby young people are engaged in a superficial, ad hoc way, often put in separate youth rooms that are pretty much really about them discussing what they want to discuss and have no connections to policy processes. And so what constitutes a meaningful youth engagement then? Number 1, this is about regularity and diversity of young people. So we want these engagements to be regular. We don't want them to happen one time and then everybody forgets about them. We need to ensure that there are diverse young people that are being involved. Young people are not a big group that has all the same opinion. And I often get asked the question, what does the youth think? Well, I can't say what does the youth think. All of youth everywhere, same as for any other group. This is just simply not possible. And this is particularly reflected also within the context of the discussion on the Just Transition, where we do really see different countries and different regions represented. Number 2 is co-creation. Co-creation with young people, with youth organizations, with youth stakeholders. It's really seeing young people and youth stakeholders as equal partners in the process. And this links to co-ownership. It's making sure that young people are involved in the steering committees, young people are involved in discussions, in the planning phase, in the monitoring phase, throughout the whole decision-making process. This is also about providing resources and adequate tools to youth stakeholders. Very often, youth organizations function really on very, very, very limited resources. In fact, majority of youth organizations are voluntary organizations, which means they have extremely limited resources. It is very much done, next to their studies, their jobs, sometimes even a couple jobs to be able to sustain themselves. And this is really the motivation, the energy, and the passion of young people that I also see every single day with my organization that is driving the process. And finally, a really important element is the follow-up processes. So making sure that this is not a one-time thing, making sure that young people know what is being done with their inputs. We're not bringing young people in a discussion just because this is fun. Yes, it is fun and it is very important, but we need to make sure that they understand how do these inputs then translate into policy making. It might be that some of them are not accepted, it might be that some of them are, but there needs to be a clear discussion, a clear understanding and information about what was being done with those inputs. Otherwise, and we see that also in our work, we see young people getting very excited about certain processes, going there, really putting all their passion, ideas, experience, innovative perspectives, and that all is lost. So this is really a huge, big lost resource if we don't focus on that. I just wanted to say I think it's extremely important for the just transition to happen with a very meaningful and active engagement of all generations. And I think at the core of that really is collaboration, intergenerational collaboration. So I hope we can all use our positions, our power, and our privilege to work towards that together. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Agata. Agata mentioned all the challenges in relation to reinforcing meaningful youth participation. Katja and Maggie, you have been working on the issue of inequalities, rising inequalities in times of crisis, and you have authored this very important flagship report. Can you tell us a little bit? Can you discuss a little bit the youth participation in times of crisis?
Thanks a lot, Maria. Is the microphone on?
I think so,
yeah?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you again for the opportunity to present a little bit from our flagship report. I think it is more kind of putting the theme of today into context. The report is on crisis of inequality, shifting power for a new eco-social contract. And I think the content of the report ties in with the topic of today in three ways. For one, the report shows how young people and children are disproportionately affected both by inequalities and by crises, which means that we need to increase efforts to promote protection, support of youth, participation of young people. Second, the report identifies just transitions as one pathway out of crisis and towards more sustainable futures. And we will zoom in on the just transition aspect in the session 1 of today's workshop. And finally, in the report, we put forward the concept of a new ecological social contract, an eco-social contract. And of course, that is something that is not existing so far. It is in the making. I was very curious to hear about these citizen assemblies, youth participation, about how different groups of citizens and people start to discuss, what a new social contract should look like. And we are deeply convinced that young people have a very important say in this. So let me just give you a little bit of an insight into the report. We don't have slides because we were asked to be very short. So just a little overview of what is in there. And we very much encourage you to take a look at the report. So the report came out in a moment of deep and interconnected crisis last year. And I think we can say with confidence that this hasn't changed up until today. We are dealing with violent conflict, with war, with environmental destruction, political and social polarization, the fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic, and skyrocketing inequalities. And the question that the report asks is, how did we get to this stage? And second, how can we overcome these challenges? Because the challenges that we are facing now, and the recent data published by the United Nations clearly show it, whether it's the Human Development Report or the recent data from the Secretariat, that for the first time in many, many years, we are backsliding. We are not only not achieving the SDGs and our goals, but we are also going backwards on a lot of indicators. This is quite worrying because when you remember when we started this process 7 years ago and member states committed to the Sustainable Development Goals, we were in quite an euphoric and optimistic mood. It was a big milestone to create this agenda, which was so much more inclusive and participatory in its making. And secondly, was much more comprehensive in terms of the goals and the visions that it set forward. And it was a big milestone that inequality was included as one of the goals, because there was an increasing understanding that focusing on poverty alone and some other social development indicators is not enough. There was a lot of research already out there since many decades that inequalities are actually a main barrier and obstacle towards development, towards poverty reduction, but also with regard to growth or economic development or any type of social progress. So on the one hand, this was a major progress to have inequality in the agenda, not only as SDG 10, which stipulates to reduce inequalities within and between countries, but also related to horizontal inequalities and mainly as a cross-cutting issue within the agenda. However, what we also want to highlight in the report is that the way that most member states deal with inequalities at the moment is not enough, because there is still a focus on the bottom of the pyramid, on trying to increase, the share of the bottom 40% of the population in growth to a higher extent than average growth. But there is not much focus on the top of the income distribution. And this report makes a strong argument, together with many other economists and many other scientists and groups and NGOs such as Oxfam, that we really have to focus on the top of the income distribution, on the 1% economy, because this extreme concentration of wealth and income also has very clear implications for governance, for influence of elites on policy making, for distribution, and for sustainable development in all of its dimensions. So in the report, we analyzed the current global context, the trends and the crisis shaping it, inequality in its various forms, and policy recommendations, with particular emphasis on case studies of the Global South, in the Global South. And I think that would also be one of my suggestions for this workshop. Also, we have a lot on what's going on in Europe, but when we talk about just transitions, we always have to think, what does it mean, a just transition for the Global South? There are issues of redistribution between countries, of solidarity in our international community. So just transition cannot be just one concept for transitions within the Global North countries. One of the key messages of the report is that inequality and crises are not destiny. They are built in by design to a certain extent. And this is why we have a strong recommendation actually to address root causes, make structural changes, and move towards a different economic system. And this is what we call, a new eco-social contract. And let me pass over now to my colleague Maggie Carter to provide some more details on the report.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Katja, and thanks to the Graduate Institute again for hosting. As Katja mentioned, the crisis context at the present moment is certainly undeniable. And as we know, such crises lead to disproportionate impacts on different groups, in particular marginalized groups suffering the worst impacts. And as we're talking about youth, today youth are certainly particularly vulnerable to a number of crises. For one, young people have been particularly hard hit by the pandemic, with disproportionate effects on unemployment, mental health, digital inclusion, not to mention huge impacts on educational opportunities. Pandemic-related impacts on employment were twice as severe on young adults, data shows. And even before the pandemic, young people were 3 times more likely to be unemployed than older workers, and twice as likely to live in extreme poverty. In addition to the health and financial crises, climate crises and war and conflict also have significant impacts on young people's futures and life prospects. Yet, despite the severity of crisis we're presently facing, not everyone is losing out. As the report shows, wealth concentration has increased considerably, with most recent data from Credit Suisse showing that the number of high net worth individuals increased by 50% in the past 2 years. This is not a coincidence. Our global system is set up in such a way that allows a small subset of people to profit off of the losses of others and the opportunity that crisis provides to exploit them. Inequality and crisis are intimately linked, and the report sets out to make those links extremely clear. Inequality drives crisis, and crisis increases inequality. compounding and accelerating to create extreme vulnerability, disparity, and unsustainability. Many people have said that our system is broken. However, we argue in this report that inequality is not a flaw in the system, but rather a feature of it. It's built in by design to benefit the few at the expense of the many. The report looks to the past to explore the policy choices that have set us on this path of neoliberal hyperglobalization, in which economic and profit objectives supersede social and ecological ones. The report sets out to identify and investigate the actors largely responsible, elites, and explore the way that imbalances drive global inequalities and crisis, and vice versa. The report then examines the different ways that elites accumulate resources and translate those resources into power and influence, and what the consequences of that power are for our global society. We explore the role of business networks, lobbying, and media capture. In influencing electoral processes and the outsized sway of corporations have in global decision making. And on the other side, we look at vulnerable and marginalized groups who bear the brunt of the negative impacts of crisis and how their power to do something about it is highly constrained because they lack resources and because of the way in which political space is dominated by elites. And I'll pass to Katja to just conclude briefly on the report's vision for the future.
Yeah, unfortunately, we have a bit of a pressure to leave the room. Yeah. But for the sake of our online participants, I would like to have the 2 minutes to finish the presentation. So it is a bleak picture that we present, and we make a lot of emphasis on the power imbalances, as you have just heard. But we also think that there is an opportunity now to come together and to redesign the system and to make the necessary changes for sustainable futures. And the Secretary General of the United Nations has used the concept of a new social contract a couple of years ago already. And since then, we have observed that a lot of stakeholders actually use that concept in order to bring together people in discussing normative principle, but also very practical obligations, commitments, and rights, that different groups have in this process of moving towards a just transition. And in the report, we identify a couple of principles for building a new eco-social contract, which we see as a normative framework that could rebalance some of the problematic relationships that we have between people and the environment in terms of human rights, in terms of gender justice, historical injustices, the missing or eroding solidarity, and the multilateral system that needs to be reformed and re-envisaged. So that is an important part of our forward-looking proposal that is in the report, and we are happy to discuss that a little bit more during the workshop. And the second is to underpin this movement towards a new eco-social contract with a new development paradigm, which we think needs to build on 3 pillars. New economic approaches, and the Green New Deal, for example, is one of it. Just transitions is also part of these alternative visions towards production and consumption. A second important pillar is transformative social policy, and within that we put a lot of focus on care, turning economies into care economies to both make them more sustainable and more gender equal, and certainly reform multilateral system. And I stop here.
Thank you so much.
Looking forward to discussing this further during the day. Thank you.